They called him the cleaning lady's son, laughed when he sat down, tried to erase him before the meeting even began, but what happened next shattered every assumption about wealth, power, and legacy. At just 17, Langston Pierce didn't take revenge. He rewrote the rules. What started as public humiliation became a blueprint for systemic change. This is the true story of how a boy they tried to dismiss became the architect of a global movement. The room was all polished oak, soft leather, and controlled smiles. Every detail whispering wealth and control. It wasn't just a law office. It was a shrine to power. Langston Pierce stood alone near the entrance, his charcoal suit wrinkled at the cuffs, one hand gripping a worn leather bag. 17 years old, dark-skinned, tightly coiled hair, and clearly not one of them. He didn't need anyone to say it aloud. He felt it in the way people glanced, then looked away, in the heavy pause that followed his every step. "What's he doing here?" murmured a voice near the back of the room. The woman who spoke wore pearls like armor and clutched her designer purse with both hands, as if shielding herself. Her tone wasn't angry, just confused, as if she couldn't reconcile Langston's presence with the mahogany panels and espresso service. A younger man in a pale blue suit leaned toward the others, chuckling under his breath. "Must be here to collect something for the janitorial staff. He's probably lost." Langston heard every word. He didn't flinch. That was a skill he had learned early, not reacting. His mother called it survival posture. You don't show pain. You don't show anger. You absorb it and hold your head up. His eyes traveled across the family gathered in front of him. The Crawfords, America's refined elite. Not born rich, but refined into it over 2 generations. Their wealth came from defense contracts, private equity, and quiet political donations. They believed they had earned it. That belief made them dangerous. And Langston? He had no business being here, not according to them. No blood ties, no place in the lineage, no voice in the room. The door creaked, and the murmurs fell silent as Eldridge Mason entered, an aging attorney with a posture too upright for his age, and a face that had weathered too many boardroom betrayals. He nodded politely to the assembled Crawfords before turning to Langston with quiet clarity. "Mr. Pierce," Mason said, gesturing toward the single empty seat right beside his desk. "Would you kindly join me here?" Langston moved without hesitation, walking past the stunned expressions of a family so unused to being surprised. Some tried to mask their disbelief. Others didn't bother. One man audibly scoffed. "Seriously?" came the voice from across the room, belonging to Everett Crawford III, heir apparent and CEO of Crawford Strategic Holdings. "Do we know this kid?" Mason didn't flinch. "You should," he replied calmly. "Langston Pierce, son of Olivia Pierce, who worked for your family for over a decade." A silence descended. Tense. Electric. Not because they recognized the name, but because they didn't. Langston's mother had cooked for them, cleaned after them, and raised their children. But none of them had cared enough to learn her son's name. That was the first fracture, psychological and cultural. A collision between self-perceived superiority and the undeniable truth that someone they had dismissed for years was now central to the reading of the will. It wasn't just disrespect, it was erasure, normalized and inherited. Langston's presence challenged their entire schema. He sat down, spine straight, jaw set. Inside, he was quiet, but not calm. This moment, this humiliation cloaked as indifference, wasn't new. It was just televised now, played out on a stage of wood and whispers. What none of them yet knew was that Langston Pierce was not here to take power. He was here to redefine it. The screen emerged silently from behind a sliding walnut panel, its appearance as seamless and polished as everything else in the room. The Crawfords turned toward it with a mix of boredom and mild anticipation. Another formality in the carefully choreographed theater of inheritance. Langston said nothing. He knew something they didn't. The screen flickered. Static gave way to a familiar face. Eduardo Crawford, patriarch of the empire, seated in a sunlit study, pale but composed, his voice soft but unmistakably firm. "If you're watching this," Eduardo began, "then I've passed on. And you're likely expecting your piece of what I've built. But before we talk about assets, I want to ask you a question." The room shifted, feet adjusted, eyes narrowed. "Can any of you tell me the name of Olivia Pierce's son?" No one answered. The silence wasn't just quiet, it was accusatory. Langston felt their eyes move toward him, slowly, like a shadow spreading across the floor. Eduardo nodded on the screen, as if confirming what he already knew. "I didn't think so." He leaned forward. "You've walked past him for years. He's delivered your food, carried your bags, been in your homes. And you never asked his name, not once. That silence, that indifference, told me everything I needed to know." Everett looked down. Marissa fidgeted with her scarf. One of the younger cousins cleared her throat but said nothing. It wasn't guilt they were feeling. It was exposure. Eduardo had punctured the illusion. "What I've built," Eduardo continued, "didn't start with wealth. It started with people. My first investor was a dishwasher. My first secretary worked 2 jobs and still brought me coffee with a smile. I didn't forget that, but somewhere along the line you all did." There it was, the cultural fracture laid bare. Eduardo had seen it, how the family had traded humility for hierarchy, connection for control. While they ascended, they built walls, around their homes, around their minds. Langston watched as Eduardo's expression hardened. "In my last year, I began spending time with Langston. During his breaks, he would sit with me in the garden, just talking about law, about justice, about his mother. And I realized something I hadn't seen in years, real vision. The kind that doesn't wear a suit, the kind that doesn't need a boardroom to prove its worth." Eduardo's voice slowed, thick with effort. "Langston has endured things most of you can't imagine. He didn't ask for a favor. He didn't seek revenge. He spoke with clarity and compassion. That's why I made the decision I did." The camera zoomed slightly. Eduardo's eyes sharpened. "I have left 53% of my voting shares in Crawford Strategic Holdings to Langston Pierce. I have also entrusted him with the Olivia Pierce Foundation, to be established with $15 million in seed funding, focused on equity, education, and restorative justice." Gasps, audible, unrehearsed. Everett shot to his feet. "This is absurd," he barked. "He manipulated my father in his final months. This is elder abuse." The lawyer, Mason, didn't blink. Everything was verified, witnessed, recorded. Eduardo was of sound mind. He passed a full neurocognitive evaluation 6 weeks before making the final amendment. Langston remained seated, his expression unreadable. What the Crawfords didn't realize was that this wasn't merely a will, it was an indictment. Eduardo had constructed a legal and moral reckoning, not just for inheritance, but for legacy. Not just for property, but for posture, who they had become, and what they had allowed. The video resumed. "If you're angry," Eduardo said, "you should ask yourselves why. If you believe Langston is unworthy, look at what you're really protecting. Your position, not your values. I've seen how some of you treat workers, how you laugh at pain, how you explain away cruelty with tradition." He paused. Langston refused this at first. He thought he didn't belong. It took me time to convince him that not belonging to your circles is exactly what qualifies him. This wasn't just Eduardo's farewell. It was his confession. He had watched his family calcify into elitism and had chosen disruption as redemption. Langston will not lead alone, Eduardo clarified. He will be supported by an independent transition board, diverse in experience and background. People like Dr. Zora Bradley, who once sued this company for wage discrimination. She's now its ethics officer. Or Miguel Torres, laid off after suggesting profit sharing. He's your new labor liaison. Murmurs rippled. This wasn't redistribution, it was reconstitution. The board's role, Eduardo explained, isn't to protect wealth, it's to protect purpose. Langston inhaled slowly. He wasn't sure if what he felt was relief or weight, maybe both. Eduardo's final words played, his voice now fragile. Langston, you will face resistance. From them, from shareholders, from the press. But you are not alone, and you are not small. Don't just lead. Redefine what leadership means. The screen went black. What followed wasn't rage. It was rupture. The Crawfords were not simply being denied money. They were being confronted with a truth they had refused to acknowledge, that their wealth was not a reflection of merit, but of margin, of how much space they took without asking. Langston remained quiet, not because he lacked words, but because he understood something they didn't yet grasp. He wasn't Eduardo's replacement. He was Eduardo's correction. Everett's voice shattered the silence first. His anger, once veiled in sarcasm, now burned openly. This is a disgrace, he snapped, pacing in tight circles. We built this company. We carried it through 2 recessions. And now it's being handed to... He stopped short of saying it, but everyone in the room heard the word that wanted to be said. Langston didn't move. He didn't have to. Across the room, Marissa Crawford rose from her chair. Always the diplomatic one, she adopted a careful tone, measured outrage wrapped in corporate polish. Langston, this isn't personal, she said with a tight smile. But you must understand the optics. You have no experience in strategic finance, no boardroom exposure. You can't possibly understand how this enterprise functions. Langston didn't respond, because she wasn't really speaking to him. She was speaking to the room, making a case not just for herself, but for their entire worldview. That power should stay where it's always been. The real breakdown wasn't about money, it was psychological, an identity crisis. For the Crawfords, Eduardo's decision represented a full-scale narrative collapse. Their sense of superiority wasn't just generational, it was performative, reinforced by rituals of access, language, and exclusion. And now, a teenager they had ignored for years was not only in the room, he was the room's center. Eldridge Mason calmly cleared his throat and lifted another envelope from his briefcase. There is one more message to share, he said. Everett groaned. What now? A loyalty test? Mason ignored him and inserted the flash drive into the console. The screen lit up again, revealing a second recording. Eduardo sat in a different setting this time, no longer in his study but in a wheelchair outside, sunlight washing over his weathered face. If this second video is playing, Eduardo said, then someone has challenged the legality of my will or the merit of my decision. The camera zoomed slightly as he spoke slower, each word deliberate. I anticipated resistance. That's why I didn't make this decision alone. In the last 3 months of my life, I recorded dozens of conversations, private, candid, documenting how you speak about people who aren't in the room, your employees, your partners, your own community. The screen shifted. One by one, edited clips played. Everett berating a temp worker, Marissa mocking a receptionist's accent, a cousin laughing about a failed disability hire, another making a racially coded joke at a party. Each clip played like a scalpel, clean, sharp, and indisputable. No shouting now, just silence, punctuated by the steady hum of the air conditioner. Eduardo's voice returned. This isn't revenge. This is documentation. This is what you've said when you thought no one important was listening. Psychologically, the effect was devastating. Cognitive dissonance settled in like a slow leak. The family wasn't merely confronted with what Eduardo thought, they were being forced to hear themselves, without filters, without deniability. That's why I chose Langston, Eduardo continued. Not to punish you, but to protect what we've forgotten, our obligation to those who made our comfort possible. Marissa finally sat down, her face pale, eyes unfocused. Everett looked smaller than he had minutes earlier. Not because he had changed, but because the room's lens had. Langston could have gloated, but he didn't. He recognized that what was happening wasn't transformation. Not yet, it was collapse. And people don't transform while falling, they only react. And then came the unexpected voice. Thomas T.J. Crawford, Eduardo's younger brother, once a quiet figure on the family's periphery, stood slowly. "Langston," he said, his voice unsteady, "I remember your mother. Olivia made my son's lunch every day when my wife was in rehab. You deserve better than what we've given you. And I'm sorry." Langston looked up. It was the first time anyone in that room had addressed him directly, without a tone of fear or accusation. TJ continued, "I didn't know what Eduardo was planning. But I see it now. This company, this family, it needed this rupture. We've been rotting inside the armor of our own success." He turned to Everett. "This isn't about Langston, it's about us." It was a rare moment, one that hinted at possibility, not because it fixed anything, but because it acknowledged what had been broken. Mason took the floor again. "Let me be clear. The transition board is already in place. Legal authority has been transferred. But Mr. Eduardo's vision wasn't to simply remove power, it was to share it, to democratize it." He turned to Langston. "As part of the transfer, you are also granted full authority to implement structural reforms, including, if you so choose, a social accountability program for legacy shareholders." Everett shook his head. "You want us to take classes now, volunteer in low-income neighborhoods, learn how to talk to people without sounding like masters?" Langston finally spoke, his voice calm. "Number, I want you to see what the world looks like from the other side. And if it takes classes or community work for that to happen, then yes, that's what I want." The room didn't erupt again, it deflated. The Crawfords weren't being kicked out of the empire. They were being offered a mirror. Some would smash it. Some would avoid it. A few, just a few, might choose to look. And Langston knew that was enough. Because revolutions don't start when systems fall. They start when stories change. Langston Pierce stood at the head of the long conference table, a space once occupied exclusively by Crawfords and their consultants. Now, the air in the room felt different, less rehearsed, less owned. To his left sat Dr. Zora Bradley, once branded a problem employee for calling out inequity in the firm's hiring practices. To his right was Miguel Torres, the former analyst who had been fired the day after submitting a proposal for employee profit sharing. Beside them sat three others, a warehouse manager, a single father from operations, and a systems engineer laid off during a strategic restructuring that mysteriously spared only executives. All of them now were the newly appointed board of Crawford Strategic Holdings. Langston had asked them to wear whatever they felt most comfortable in. No suits, no scripts, just themselves. He stood silently for a moment, letting the room settle. "I know what this looks like," he said finally. "To some people, this feels like revenge, like a takedown." He paused, locking eyes with Everett and Marissa, who sat stiffly on the other side of the room, relegated to non-voting observer seats per the new charter. "But it's not." Langston clicked the remote. The screen behind him lit up with an aerial image of a crumbling neighborhood. Streets flooded after rain, rows of houses half collapsed. "This is East Garden Park." These plots were quietly acquired by the Crawford Foundation decades ago. Families were evicted. The land banked for future development. It was never developed, just held, forgotten by everyone but those forced to leave. He turned back to the room. Until now. Langston had already signed the transfer documents. Those plots would be handed back to community trusts managed by local residents with clear titles and funding for redevelopment. No strings, no tax shelters. What we took without consent we're returning without condition. The announcement didn't go viral immediately, but within 24 hours, drone footage of volunteers rebuilding houses in East Garden Park was circulating with hashtags like #LandBack and #Justice in Action. That's when the story shifted, from a will reading to a movement. Langston understood the power of spectacle, but he also understood the limits of punishment. People only change when they understand the systems that shaped them and see a new way forward. That's why he insisted the reintegration program for legacy Crawfords focus not on performative apology tours, but immersive education. Each participant would volunteer in underserved communities, sit in classrooms led by those they once ignored, and complete a capstone project designed to repair a past injustice, personal or corporate. Marissa called it reputation laundering. Langston called it accountability with structure. Psychologists warned him that the program would be met with pride-fueled resistance. They were right. Everett refused outright. Patricia, after the viral fallout of her racist social post, signed up the next day. Not out of altruism, but out of necessity. That was fine with Langston. The path mattered more than the motivation. Meanwhile, inside the company, he enacted policies previously dismissed as utopian. A profit-sharing model pegged to hours worked and years served. An equity review board made up of hourly employees. Transparency audits on wage gaps, hiring patterns, and disciplinary actions. Early results were promising. Turnover dropped, productivity rose. A quiet buzz grew among progressive investment firms looking for ESG-aligned portfolios. Langston wasn't just challenging power, he was reframing its incentives. Still, the challenges loomed. Social backlash simmered on fringe platforms. Legacy clients threatened to pull contracts. Anonymous letters accused him of dividing the firm. An editorial in a financial magazine asked, "Is this the end of corporate meritocracy?" Langston smiled when he read that one. Because it was never meritocracy, it was inheritance masquerading as merit. He understood what few in his position ever had to, that reparation isn't a transaction, it's a transition. One that demands stamina, clarity, and an ability to withstand resentment from those who believe equity feels like loss. Privately, Langston sometimes wondered how long he could keep going. He was 17, still finishing high school via night classes. His mother, Olivia, now undergoing treatment for a chronic condition long ignored, remained his emotional anchor. But the pressure was immense. Every decision, every headline, every misstep would be amplified and politicized. It was the cost of being both symbol and steward. And yet, he wasn't alone. Dr. Bradley handled internal ethics training with a precision that came from lived experience. Torres, now Director of Workforce Strategy, had already implemented a mentorship pipeline for entry-level staff. Together, they were reshaping not just who sat at the table, but what the table was for. Langston closed the meeting with a short message. We're not building a better version of what came before. We're building something that didn't exist yet, and yes, it's uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. That quote, lifted and captioned by a journalist in the room, became the headline of an article that trended for 3 days. Uncomfortable by Design: The Teenager Rewriting Corporate America. Langston wasn't trying to go viral, he was trying to go deep. And while the Crawfords watched from the sidelines, some resisting, some beginning to reflect, the company they once ruled was evolving into something they couldn't recognize. Not a family empire, but a public promise. In the days following the public unveiling of Langston Pierce's reforms, the Crawfords found themselves at the center of a national reckoning, one they could neither predict nor control. It didn't start with a press release. It started with a silence. Clients stopped calling. Board appointments quietly disappeared. Campaign donors returned checks. No one wanted to be associated with a name now linked to arrogance, racism, and generational entitlement. Everett Crawford's photo, once a staple on magazine covers and financial news segments, now lived online in memes. Headlines called him the heir who lost the empire, while social media users layered side-by-side images of him shouting during the will reading, and Langston calmly announcing land transfers. In private, Everett still called it a media assassination, but the truth gnawed at him in ways he couldn't articulate. Not because he thought Langston was right, but because deep down, a part of him feared he might be. Psychologists call it narrative disintegration, when a person's lifelong self-concept, built on success, identity, superiority, collides with irrefutable evidence that none of it was earned the way they believed. What Everett faced wasn't just the loss of money, it was the collapse of who he thought he was. Marissa handled it differently. Her instincts were adaptive. She issued a public statement acknowledging the family's shortcomings, enrolled in the accountability program, and began volunteering at a community legal clinic that once sued the Crawfords for discriminatory lending practices. It wasn't redemption, but it was a beginning. Patricia, once an influencer known for luxury and lifestyle, now posted content on restorative justice and inclusion. After her viral humiliation, she'd lost every brand deal overnight. But Langston had offered her a seat in the accountability cohort. She accepted. Her content now featured footage of her helping rebuild homes in East Garden Park, her voiceover stripped of filters and false cheer. I thought justice was about being right, she confessed in one post. But sometimes it's about listening long enough to know you've been wrong. It went viral again, but this time for the right reasons. Not everyone came around. Uncle Martin left the country, relocating to a private estate in Portugal and issuing a bitter op-ed that painted Langston as a woke plant, and the board as cultural insurgents. The article was mocked for days, but its existence signaled something deeper: how far some would go to preserve delusion. Back in the company headquarters, Langston read the piece in silence. He didn't need to respond. Reality had already done that. The corporate transition had triggered cascading reforms. A third-party equity audit uncovered decades of suppressed complaints and financial misreporting. Several senior executives resigned. Others were quietly replaced by internal candidates, many of whom had been overlooked for years. Meanwhile, the reintegration program expanded. It wasn't mandatory, but participation came with benefits: restored voting shares, advisory roles, and stipends tied to community reinvestment. Langston refused to make morality transactional, but he did believe in incentives. Still, no structure could soften the emotional toll. One evening, Langston walked into the former executive dining room, now a public cafe shared by interns and staff. There, sitting alone, was Everett. His suit wrinkled, his tie removed, his hands wrapped around a paper cup. Langston approached cautiously. "You don't have to do this," Everett muttered without looking up. Langston sat anyway. "I'm not here to punish you," he said, "but you need to see what happens when we mistake inheritance for integrity." Everett didn't respond, but he didn't walk away either. The next day, Everett registered for the accountability program. His participation wouldn't make headlines, but it would shift something intangible: perspective. Across the city, ripple effects began to emerge. A local university offered Langston an honorary fellowship to co-develop a curriculum on equitable business leadership. A foundation pledged $10 million to expand his housing justice model. Other corporations, initially skeptical, began quietly consulting with Langston's board on restructuring their own systems. But not all consequences were clean. Some displaced landowners, rightfully resentful, demanded restitution beyond titles. Others felt the board's outreach was too slow. A protest erupted after a former employee accused the company of performative inclusion. Langston listened to all of it, because he knew that transparency without responsiveness was just theater. Internally, he struggled. Balancing high school classes with corporate leadership drained him. His mother's treatment stabilized, but her recovery was slow. Some nights, he fell asleep over audit reports. Other nights, he didn't sleep at all. Dr. Zora Bradley began checking in on him regularly. So did Torres. Quiet acts of care emerged, replacing the cold efficiency that once ruled the company's hallways. That, perhaps, was the most radical transformation of all. Crawford Strategic Holdings had become a case study, not in collapse but in course correction, not in revenge but in responsibility. And the Crawfords, those who stayed, found themselves at a crossroads. They could continue defending a story that no longer served them, or they could write a new one. Langston never demanded their remorse. He asked for their participation, and that, he believed, was how empires fall or rise, not through verdicts but through choice. 6 months after the seismic reading of Eduardo Crawford's will, the headquarters of Crawford Strategic Holdings no longer looked like the fortress of corporate tradition it once was. The private elevator once reserved for executives had been decommissioned. The top floor, formerly the domain of high-powered lunches and behind closed-door negotiations, now housed a community hub for financial literacy, youth mentorship, and small business incubation. On any given weekday, the building echoed with unfamiliar energy. Students in jeans and backpacks pouring out of classroom-style boardrooms, multilingual signage posted in break rooms, and soft jazz drifting from shared workspaces where junior analysts collaborated directly with senior strategists, many of whom had once ignored their names. Langston Pierce walked the halls in black sneakers, not designer loafers. He greeted each employee by name, from security guards to kitchen staff. His days began at 6 a.m., balancing high school classes online with back-to-back policy reviews, investor briefings, and internal audits. His mother, Olivia, now in remission and seated on the company's community oversight board, often reminded him to rest. He rarely listened. Despite his age, Langston's presence carried weight. Not because of volume, but because of vision. His first directive had been simple: restructure the way the company defines value. That meant abandoning legacy metrics that favored shareholder returns above all else. Instead, the board adopted a triple bottom-line model: people, planet, and profit. The idea wasn't new, but Langston's approach was. He embedded it into every department's KPIs, linked executive bonuses to equity targets, and initiated mandatory annual community audits to be reviewed at public forums. Investors were skeptical. One even stormed out of a meeting mid-presentation. But within 2 quarters, the results spoke louder than any rebuttal. Employee retention increased by 32%. Operational efficiency, once hampered by top-heavy decision-making, jumped after Langston approved a ground-up feedback loop that rewarded innovation from entry-level staff. Then came the external effects. The properties returned to families in East Garden Park were now collectively governed by resident associations. With seed funding from the Olivia Pierce Foundation, they launched their own worker cooperatives, carpentry shops, urban farms, and a digital design agency run by formerly unemployed youth. One former janitor became head of operations at a recycled materials startup incubated in the very building he used to clean. The media tried to name it. The Langston Effect, Crawford 2.0, the teen tycoon of justice. Langston ignored all of it. He didn't want to be a celebrity. He wanted a blueprint others could adopt, adapt, or challenge. To ensure transparency, the company launched an open-access dashboard detailing internal demographics, pay equity, climate impact, and community investments. Every quarter, the public could view progress and failures. Langston insisted that the board publish shortfall reports alongside success stories. Accountability was no longer internal, it was communal. Still, not everything was seamless. An inherited supply chain contract was found to violate labor laws overseas. Rather than spin the issue, Langston publicly canceled the contract, partnered with a third-party watchdog, and launched a task force to build a new, ethical sourcing model. The move cost the company $4.8 million in short-term losses, but it also triggered a surge in partnerships from mission-aligned firms. In a moment that captured national attention, a viral video showed Langston visiting a previously shuttered manufacturing facility that had once been owned by Crawford Holdings but abandoned during a tax restructuring 10 years earlier. He met with displaced workers, many of whom were Black and Latino, and listened, not as a figurehead, but as a student. 2 weeks later, the company purchased the site, rehired over 60 former employees, and converted it into a modular housing production hub for low-income families. The story was picked up by global media outlets. That same week, the company's stock, which had dipped after Langston's appointment, rose 11%. But the numbers weren't the most important indicator of success. It was the cultural shift. Workplace satisfaction surveys reflected a near-unanimous belief that employees felt heard, respected, and seen. In a particularly moving moment, a veteran administrator named Ms. June, who'd survived 6 executive turnovers, told Langston during a town hall, "For the first time in 20 years, this place feels like it belongs to us too." Langston blinked back tears, not because he was tired, but because he finally believed the shift was real. The viral power of his story didn't come from spectacle. It came from scale. Thousands of young viewers followed the company's journey through weekly social media updates filmed in-house. One episode, showing Langston leading a roundtable with formerly incarcerated individuals now working in logistics, hit 5 million views in 3 days. The comments weren't just likes, they were questions, demands, invitations. Can we start this model in Detroit? What's the name of that mentorship toolkit? Where's the employee equity policy template? Drop the link. So they did. Langston's team created a public resource library for anyone seeking to replicate the model, complete with legal guides, equity checklists, and mentorship frameworks. It became more than a company. It became a movement. And yet, Langston remained cautious. He knew success was fragile, that there were still systemic policies, tax loopholes, zoning restrictions, labor exemptions, that could undo everything if not addressed collectively. So he formed a policy council. Former staffers joined forces with legal scholars, housing advocates, and young organizers. Together, they began drafting white papers to submit to lawmakers on ethical corporate governance and urban reparative development. One policy brief, titled From Inheritance to Inclusion, gained traction across city governments and was adopted in pilot form by the mayor's office in Newark. Langston didn't claim credit. He didn't have to. The work was already speaking for itself. But perhaps the clearest sign of transformation came on a Wednesday morning. Langston stepped into the company lobby and saw Everett Crawford, dressed in modest attire, holding a clipboard and quietly helping direct guests to a public seminar being hosted upstairs. Langston nodded. Everett returned it. No applause, no headlines, just participation. That, Langston believed, was the real marker of change. Not the collapse of power, but its redistribution. Not punishment, participation, not revenge, redesign. Langston Pierce never intended to become a global figure. But by the 7th month of his tenure, his name began surfacing in circles far beyond the boardrooms and neighborhoods he originally set out to transform. At a policy summit in Geneva, an executive from a multinational development firm cited Crawford Holdings as a model for ethical restructuring in post-colonial economies. In Lagos, a youth cooperative organizing land return campaigns referenced Langston's decision to transfer property titles as a proof point that corporate reparation wasn't just possible, it was scalable. Across social media, the phrase #Redesign Not Revenge became shorthand for a growing global discourse, one that demanded justice without replicating the power dynamics of the past. Journalists from France to Brazil requested interviews. University classrooms dissected his model. Think tanks debated whether Langston's approach could be replicated in economies shaped by centuries of wealth extraction. Langston didn't travel much. School, company operations, and his mother's care left little time. But he began hosting open global forums online, not TED-style performances, conversations, live, unfiltered, with frontline workers, students, single mothers, and community organizers. He didn't position himself as an answer. He positioned himself as a bridge. The response was staggering. These weren't passive audiences. They were participants, sharing frameworks, challenges, adaptations. A farmer from Oaxaca described building cooperative irrigation systems based on Langston's resource redistribution model. A refugee-led tech group in Berlin launched a microgrant fund using the Crawford Equity Index template. Even in countries where the Crawford name meant little, the principles behind the movement, transparency, dignity, shared stewardship, spoke louder than branding ever could. But with attention came criticism. Some accused Langston of idealism. Others claimed his model wasn't serious business. A cable pundit sneered, "He's running a non-profit fantasy camp, not a company." Langston didn't respond publicly. He didn't need to, because by the end of the fiscal year, Crawford Holdings had outperformed its own projections. Revenue was up 14%. Retention hit a record high. Customer loyalty scores doubled. Investors, once skeptical, now asked how they could support the mission. But metrics weren't the true validation. It was the shift in who held the mic. At the company's first International Equity Symposium, the keynote speaker wasn't Langston. It was Rosa Mendoza, a former cafeteria worker who now led the company's food justice initiative. She shared how corporate kitchens had been reimagined as sites of empowerment, offering culinary training, small business partnerships, and sourcing deals with local growers. That wasn't just a department upgrade. It was a new paradigm. Langston watched from the back of the room, arms crossed, heart full. Later, in a quiet interview, a French journalist asked him the question that framed the entire narrative. "Why didn't you crush the family that tried to humiliate you?" Langston smiled. "Because if I do that, I become what I was fighting. That's not power, that's recycling pain." He paused. "Power isn't the ability to punish. It's the choice to build something no one believes can exist and prove them wrong." In that moment, Langston redefined more than his family's legacy. He redefined what it means to lead. Not by dominating rooms, but by redesigning who gets to enter them and why. 12 months after Langston Pierce stepped into a room where no one believed he belonged, the headquarters of Crawford Strategic Holdings welcomed a new kind of gathering. Not an investor summit, not a shareholder vote, but the official inauguration of the Eduardo Crawford Institute for Economic Justice. The main hall was filled, not with suits and nameplates, but with teachers, bus drivers, union organizers, and high school students in borrowed blazers. The walls that once bore oil portraits of CEOs now showcased murals by local artists, bold, vibrant depictions of communities in motion, reclaiming what had long been denied. Langston stood at the edge of the stage, not center, flanked by a diverse group of speakers representing every department, every floor, every zip code touched by the company's transformation. The moment didn't belong to him alone. It never had. The Institute, funded with $30 million redirected from corporate lobbying budgets, offered free training programs in cooperative economics, labor rights, public finance, and participatory urban planning. The goal wasn't to create more CEOs. It was to equip communities with tools to navigate and reshape systems that had historically excluded them. Langston opened the event with a simple statement. "1 year ago, I was seen as an intruder. Today, I'm just part of the redesign." The audience rose to their feet. But the applause wasn't for Langston. It was for the story that had outgrown any single name. Outside the building, change rippled outward. In East Garden Park, the housing cooperative Langston helped to seed had just broken ground on its first eco-sustainable apartment complex. 10 of the construction leads were women, 3 of them formerly unhoused. In the local school district, standardized test scores among Black and Latino students had increased for the first time in 5 years, due in part to new community investment funds funneled through Crawford's reinvestment dividend policy. On a nearby billboard, the company's updated slogan read, "Crawford Strategic, built with not on." Former employees turned executives were now mentoring interns from neighborhoods the Crawfords had once displaced. A group of them, including Rosa Mendoza and Miguel Torres, had co-authored a policy report on reparative business practices that was being considered by the City Council for local adoption. The company was no longer a closed circuit of wealth. It had become a circulatory system of responsibility. But with transformation came growing pains. A minority group of shareholders filed a petition challenging the redirection of profits to community-controlled funds. They called it Mission Drift. A media outlet ran an exposé titled, "When Activists Become Executives, Is There a Line?" Online critics mocked the board's diversity efforts as corporate cosplay. Langston read every word. He encouraged his staff to do the same, not to fear criticism, but to separate noise from needed course correction. At night, Langston still studied, still sent notes to his professors, still made dinner with his mother, who now chaired the Crawford Community Review Board and had recently spoken at a national conference on healthcare equity. Olivia Pierce didn't call herself a leader. She just said, "I'm making sure no one else gets erased." Langston knew her words weren't symbolic. They were policy. And that distinction made all the difference. The company had begun tracking a new kind of metric, Community Parity Index, measuring how equitably resources, decisions, and outcomes were distributed across race, income, and geography. It was technical, dense, but effective. The data showed something most stories didn't, that dignity, when institutionalized, is scalable. Not perfect, not fast, but real. Meanwhile, other companies began calling, not to mimic, but to learn. Some sent observers, some sent legal teams, a few sent apologies for past dismissals. Langston welcomed all of them, with one condition. "This is not about branding," he would say. "This is about systems, and systems don't change until power is reallocated, not just repackaged." One quiet afternoon, as Langston prepared for a seminar with incoming student fellows, he received a message from Everett Crawford. It was a short note. "I'm ready to participate more. I've been listening. I'm beginning to see." Langston didn't reply immediately. He let the words breathe. Because he knew something that many still hadn't realized. The real victory wasn't that he had inherited power. It was that he had created a space where power no longer needed to be inherited at all. That's how movements begin. Not with declarations, but with decisions that ripple across rooms, and eventually across generations. The morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows as Langston Pierce stood inside the Eduardo Crawford Institute, watching community members file in. Some came for legal clinics, others for leadership seminars. A few just needed a warm place to sit and think. All of them belonged. It had been a year since the will reading that changed everything. Yet Langston never spoke of it as a turning point. To him, the real revolution wasn't about that one day. It was about every day that followed, each uncomfortable conversation, each resisted reform, each moment someone who had been invisible became impossible to ignore. This was what transformation looked like. Not polished, not perfect, but permanent. The Crawfords, who had resisted, now sat on advisory panels. Some still wrestled with pride, some still made mistakes. But the difference was they were in the room, and no longer at the head of the table. Langston had replaced hierarchy with proximity. Power was no longer a fixed position. It flowed, it adjusted, it listened. He'd learned something few leaders his age, or any age, ever do. Revenge is easy. Rebuilding takes everything. The truth was, Langston had been given the tools to destroy the empire. He had the legal power, the evidence, the public momentum. But he understood what so many systems never do, that justice without compassion becomes punishment, and punishment without purpose becomes spectacle. Instead of replicating the same exclusion that had once targeted him, he redesigned the system so no one else would have to stand at the margins and wait for permission to matter. He didn't ask people to forget what happened. He asked them to build something better because of it. Outside, a mural was being painted on the north wall of the headquarters. It showed Olivia Pierce, Langston's mother, reaching out with one hand toward a group of children planting seeds in a public garden. Behind her were scenes of healing, workers voting on workplace policy, a boardroom filled with citizens, not shareholders. The banner beneath it read, "We rise when none are left behind." The mural wasn't commissioned by corporate. It was created by students from the Community Arts Program funded by the Olivia Pierce Foundation. Langston had declined to be in it. "This isn't about me," he'd said. "This is about a blueprint." Because by now, that's what Crawford Strategic Holdings had become, a replicable model of restorative enterprise. Its data-driven framework for reparative business had been adopted in pilot programs from Oakland to Glasgow. Langston, once dismissed as an unqualified teenager, was now cited in corporate governance journals and government white papers. And yet, every week, he still returned to his original classroom to finish his final year of high school. When asked why, his answer never changed. Because the work doesn't exempt me, it educates me. One journalist had described him as the quiet architect of a moral economy, another as the only CEO who replies to emails from janitors. He didn't mind either. But what meant most to him was when Olivia said simply, "You lead like you were never meant to lead alone." That was the truth. Langston didn't lead alone. He led with people who had once been excluded, with communities that had been overlooked, with systems that needed to be rebuilt from the inside out. And that, ultimately, was the revolution. Not in the headlines or viral clips, but in the hard, unglamorous labor of designing equity, not as charity, but as structure. As Langston stepped into the lobby that afternoon, a small group of interns were gathered near the front desk, watching a video from the will reading. It had resurfaced online again, now reframed with new captions, "From erased to empowered." This is what happens when compassion scales. Legacy is a decision. Langston didn't interrupt. He just smiled as he walked by. Because he knew the moment that changed everything wasn't the one where the will was read. It was the one where he chose not to weaponize pain, but to reimagine power. And that's where real revolutions begin. Not with rage, but with vision.